if he does not, I'm very outgoing. Everything's good out of time. And that's not, I think we're academic, we should probably actually.
Where it like.
But also, your tenure is a little from like, Charles Darwin lived and he's like, no, it's not that great. I'm going to talk him offloading.
All right, we're going to get started. How are you all this afternoon? I am, you all don't know how warm my heart is with this many people in this room right now for the third time in a row. Good afternoon, thank you all who have dedicated yourselves to one more of these sessions of this African American Philosophy Open Classroom for Black History Month. My name is Dr. Corey Lee, and for accessibility purposes, I am a Black man wearing a white shirt, an African print vest, black jeans, and some white Jordans. So, I'm an assistant professor of philosophy, a steering committee member of the Race, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program, as well as one of the 3 co-directors for the Hub for Black Affairs and Community Engagement. I want to thank the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies, RGSS, Butler's DEI department, LAS, the Arts and Sciences, and the Black and African Studies minor for their support. For this format, we'll start with a brief introduction to the topic that I will do, a 20-minute presentation by our guest speaker, a few preset questions, and then an open Q&A for the audience with preferential treatment to those who are enrolled in my class. We can submit questions and we can address those at the time permits. This session is being recorded, and for Butler students, BCR credit is only available for those who are in person, but you can scan that QR code at the end of today's session. I preface this conversation with a content warning that the F word regarding self-initiated death will be used regarding Huey P. Newton's work. The 1960s were a focal point in African American history and philosophy. The common themes that we draw from this period were radical articulations of dignity, varying methods of protest, and differing ideologies as it pertained to resistance coalition. Many engaged this period through Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and only engaged the popular works, the speech "I Have a Dream," or perhaps the letter from a Birmingham jail. However, King's nonviolent ideology was much more nuanced than we care to collectively remember. King's nonviolence was pragmatic. Although he had sympathy for the logic of violent protest, he was worried about the death toll it would have for his people. We see in this chapter pilgrimage to nonviolence, from strive to freedom, and the lectures on nonviolence and social change, from conscience for change, that King struggled with the intersections of his ideology, the influence of Howard Thurman and Mahatma Gandhi in his Christian love ethic, the influence of Marx in his socialist perspective, his anti-war stance in confronting the war in Vietnam, and his fears for witnessing so much terror in his lifetime. This leads us to his famous quote, "I've come to believe we're integrating into a burning house. I'm afraid that America may be losing what moral vision she may have had. And I'm afraid that even as we integrate, we are walking into a place that does not understand that this nation needs to be deeply concerned with the plight of the poor and disenfranchised. Until we commit ourselves to ensuring that the underclass is given justice and opportunity, we will continue to perpetuate the anger and violence that tears at the soul of this nation," end quote. His words have deep potency for today's political climate, as we reflect on his pathos, logos, and ethos appeal to the soul of this nation for the progression of poor people, Black people, and soldiers. One must wonder if we are any closer to his dream than in 1968 when he was assassinated. For this reason, I argue that it is important to reflect on the variety of philosophies and movements for Black rights in the 1960s. King led the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, also known as the SCLC, which focused on marches, voter education, boycotts, and other nonviolent protests. Other nonviolent organizations of the time included the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also known as the NAACP, the National Urban League, or the NUL, and the Congress on Race Equality, also known as CORE. However, there were more militant organizations as well, like the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, inspired by Malcolm X and led by people like Dr. Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, which for those who don't know, Dr. Huey P. Newton was formerly trained in social philosophy, and that's what his doctorate said. Kwame Ture, who participated in SNCC and CORE, would later go on to adopting a Pan-African ideology and emphasizing the phrase Black Power. From a philosophical standpoint, King, Ture, Newton, and X all show different forms of Black ontology. For King, it was his concept of somebodyness. For Ture, his concept of Black power begins with Black redefinition beyond white ascriptions and abandonment of shame. Huey P. Newton's famous slogan, revolutionary suicide, or to die for the people, is defined as, quote, a strong desire to live with hope and human dignity, that existence without them is impossible. When reactionary forces crush us, we must move against these forces even at the risk of death, end quote. To understand these thinkers is to engage Marxism and socialism, to engage Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism, to engage nonviolent and violent forms of self-defense, to engage American and global anti-Blackness. And it means we have to philosophically examine ontological assertions and ontological obstacles for Black existence. I end this preface with the words from Malcolm X in his 1964 speech entitled The Black Revolution. He says, quote, all of our people have the same goals, the same objective, freedom, justice, equality. All of us want recognition and respect as human beings. We don't want to be integrationists, nor do we want to be separationists. We want to be human beings. Integration is only a method that is used by some groups to obtain freedom, justice, equality, and respect as human beings. Separation is only a method that is used by other groups to obtain freedom, justice, equality, and human dignity. Our people have made the mistake of confusing the methods with the objectives. As long as we agree on objectives, we should never fall out with each other just because we believe in different methods or tactics or strategy to reach a common objective. We have to keep in mind at all times that we aren't fighting for integration, nor are we fighting for separation. We are fighting for recognition as human beings. We are fighting for the right to live as free humans in this society. In fact, we are actually fighting for rights that are even greater than civil rights, that is, human rights, end quote. There's perhaps no better person to help us analyze Malcolm X and other underanalyzed sides of the civil rights movement than Dr. Michael Sawyer. Dr. Michael Sawyer is an associate professor of English and Africana Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. He is the author of a powerful book entitled Black-Minded, The Political Philosophy of Malcolm X, where he articulates the, quote, positive, subjective self-regard and recognition, end quote, in X's political philosophy. Beyond being the author of multiple books and a few more in progress, he is one of my mentors in interdisciplinary research, specifically in the philosophical value of the literary regarding that question. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Sawyer.
Thanks so much, Professor Reed. I first want to, Corey, it's just such a pleasure to be invited. And I just want everybody to know just how fortunate you are to have an active professor like Professor Reed, who's invested in these types of conversations that, as much as I would like to be visiting you there in Indiana, it's perfect to use whatever technological resources we have in order to to be able to have these kinds of critical conversations, especially in a time when these are becoming ever more difficult and fraught, right? So, with that point of departure, I'll just get right to things so we can most efficiently use the time that we have. I'll talk a little bit about first what led me to write the book on Malcolm X, much less think about him, and then second to work through a couple of the modes of thinking that I think I was the ambition of the book was to unearth from a perspective of Malcolm X as a philosopher of both phenomenology, ontology, and epistemology. And obviously, he has an existential philosophy as well. And then to situate those with respect to the new projects that I'm working on that are based upon a continuum of that thought. So, first, to get at, and I think it's appropriate to do this because this is the 100th anniversary of Malcolm's birth, will be celebrated in May 19th of this year. So, and also Fanon and others enjoy the same centenary. So it's important for us to revisit Malcolm's thinking. And I think one of the things that's most appropriate is to realize that, as far as I can tell, Malcolm was thinking at least 60 to 70 years into the future with his system of thinking. And we're in many ways trying to catch up to many of the innovations that he was presenting with respect to several things. And I'll try to situate those in our current moment as we get to that. But for me, being a person who I grew up in the late 1900s, basically at this point, in 1970s in Chicago. So I was always aware of Malcolm's presence, both because of the continued presence of the Nation of Islam in Chicago, and also just from Malcolm X as being a constant presence in popular imagery around the South Side of Chicago at the time. So by the time I got to college in the 80s and being in and around Washington, D.C., in the run up to Spike Lee revitalizing the popular engagement with Malcolm X's work, all of that was pretty predictable or was not unfamiliar to me. But at the same time, when I decided to go back to school, I went to study what I thought was political theory and philosophy, and had unwittingly or maybe even wittingly had excluded Malcolm X from that system of thinking for reasons that are worth exploring, because those presuppositions with respect to Malcolm X's positionality within Black thought are important to interrogate. So I tell people when it comes up that kind of thinking about Fanon is what sent me to graduate school. Learning the relationship of Du Bois's thought while there was super important to me. And Toni Morrison basically becomes the thinker that drove the latter part of my study and probably informs my work in this way. But at the same time, the thing that hovered around that entire conversation was basically Malcolm X in ways that I was not even aware of. So this comes up in the early part of Black Minded. When I was in the last year of writing my dissertation, I took the entire, probably 3/4 of it, I was almost finished, and I sent it to a person who was known in the 60s and 70s as H. Rap Brown, but is now incarcerated in a federal prison. I just saw yesterday that Emil Al-Jamal has been moved to Butner. He suffers from a series of chronic illnesses, and is basically has been moved around the federal prison system. So I sent him the dissertation, basically asking for him to give me his thought on what I was doing with Fanon. He wrote me back and was like, what we were really thinking about the entire time was Malcolm X. Fanon becomes in many ways a kind of interlocutor because of the sheer amount of work that he has, right? Like Wretched of the Earth becomes the text in many ways of the movement that Professor Reed was talking about, the kind of Black Power movement. The Black Panthers study him extensively. But H. Rap Brown's point was that the ethos that informs all of that was basically exemplified by the thinking and life example of Malcolm X. So what that made me do after I finished that dissertation is to sit down and carefully interrogate what it was that I didn't think was why I didn't think Malcolm X was part of that intellectual continuum, which was obviously not true, right? So that was much about the fact that his biography in many ways, as fascinating as it is and important to pay attention to, overwhelmed in a certain sense his system of thinking, because his system of thinking was typically only expressed verbally. And it was fascinating to me once I got into this, the way in which classical philosophy is predicated on this notion of the Platonic dialogues, which are just the same type of verbal play that Malcolm X often engaged in, right? So he was not interested, or didn't really even have the time to sit down and carefully write out what he was up to. So outside of his diaries and a few other short written pieces, his work comes across verbally, right? So what that meant is, as we as scholars, particularly scholars who focus their attention on the written word, as I do, probably spending most of my time with literature, that kind of fell away. But also there was this notion that Malcolm X was an activist rather than a thinker, which is a kind of reductive presupposition that allows you to believe that activism is not informed by careful thought, right? So when I went back to revisit Malcolm, I did it from a perspective of taking his work, his speeches, and examining them in the same way that I would in the same way that I would examine or critically engage, Sylvia Wynter or anyone else. And what I found is that he has a very complex understanding of the world that is based upon a philosophical system that basically was working to develop a coherent understanding of Black subjectivity from beginning to end. And when I say beginning to end, I mean from an ontological perspective and also a futuristic perspective, to think, what does it mean to be Black in the future, which was important at the time, and I think is of paramount importance now for at least several reasons. One of them being internal to Black thought, particularly with the in some ways, I don't know if preeminence is the right term, but almost universal engagement with Afro-pessimism that I think is useful in one sense, that it basically gives us a chart of the four corners of the anti-Black world. But admittedly, and this is Frank Wilderson's understanding, is not meant to be prescriptive and to describe what happens outside of that. Malcolm is basically trying to help us understand what a world looks like beyond the four corners of anti-Black racism, and also at the same time articulate the way to get there. So what I did in kind of engaging with Malcolm's thinking from that perspective was to work through his system. And the thing that stuck out to me at the very beginning of trying to pull the project together were a couple of times when he referenced the term Black-minded, right? And what he meant by that, and there are kind of two or three places in his entire documented archive discourse where he mentions it, but it comes up in a Q&A in at least two places that preoccupied my work as a matter of a point of departure, where he was asked, it comes up when he's asked why he had abandoned, in some sense, the notion of the Back to Africa movement. And he says kind of two things in response. Now I'll basically paraphrase him without spending time kind of going to the text and basically reading from that, which is useful in some sense, but I think it's useful here just to use them as almost as signifiers for what we're trying to approach and understand. Is he's asked, why he's abandoned that movement. He says that he's thought more carefully about it, and he would like to be Black-minded enough for several things to happen. First, that he individually be Black-minded enough to then be expressed to larger Black culture, to then become Black-minded enough to either all want to leave and go back to Africa together and be able to form a societal order that includes everyone, or become so Black-minded that the powers that be in this country basically facilitate that movement, because the way in which Black folks understand the world will be such that white supremacy can no longer accommodate their presence internal to it, right? So this is a provocative way of thinking, because, and this is back to, I think, where Professor Reed was so adept at having us understand that as he evolves his thinking, the Black nationalist thought system of thinking that he has is not separationist. It's not called for separation in the sense that he had earlier in his career when it was preoccupied with the Nation of Islam. It's inclusive in ways that basically allow it to be self-reflective of its own identity and then make decisions about what it means to be Black in broad terms. When I say broad terms, it's important to understand that towards the end of his life, Black for Malcolm X becomes heuristic to think about similarly situated people with respect to uh, anti-Black racism or white colonial power, right? Colonial power generally articulated. So when he thinks about what's going on in Vietnam, when he thinks about freedom movements in Africa, when he thinks about freedom movements in Central and South America, and also what's happening in Detroit, Chicago, Newark, all of those people are Black as far as he's concerned. So it's not at the end of his system of understanding is both the understanding of Black subjectivity as diasporic Africans and also African people from the continent, but also expansive enough to include all those who have been victimized by colonial power, right? So his preoccupation then becomes international in ways that are important to understand. And towards the end of his life, Malcolm X literally had an office in the United Nations and was there receiving uh, receiving the delegations from foreign countries who were trying to understand what it meant to participate in this kind of large systemic conversation that he's having about what it means to be Black in the world at that time, right? So in going to Malcolm X's speeches, you'll see over and over again that he's doing what I call in the book, and is fairly obvious in some sense, right? It's not a phrase I coined, but one that seemed to explain what's going on. He's thinking in motion, right? And part of what I believe is his notion of being Black-minded is also being willing to abandon or evolve systems of thinking that seem to be fundamental to the prospects of what you're trying to approach, but then are either overcome by events but require you to move forward in ways that make it seem as if that doesn't matter anymore or it's no longer useful, but really it's just an evolution of a system of thinking. So there's a continuum that is also unrelated from linear systems of thinking, right? So it's very improvisational, but in the way that we understand improvisation to be only possible from a position of deeply understood study and virtuosity, right? So Malcolm is a profound improviser of Western systems of thinking that allow him to extract from it what he finds useful. And one of the fundamental aspects of that process for him is basically being able to situate himself to understand what we mean by self-consciousness. And so what I then began to understand is that what he really begins to mean by when he thinks of being Black-minded, that is a system of both cognition and a system of consciousness, which means that he has situated whatever receptors he has, whether they're physical, metaphysical, vision, sonic, taste, touch, whatever, in order to recognize the things that are necessary and be able to categorize systems of thinking, events, et cetera, in ways that become useful for the Black liberation struggle or notions of kind of freedom, which is the kind of foundational aspirational goal and also the telos of the system of thinking, right? So if we think about cognition and consciousness, we then begin to understand that then in the formulation that I think he's presenting to us, cognition and consciousness become something that leads towards a system of being, right? And so that necessarily, in my way of approaching this, engages directly the system of W.E.B. Du Bois. And I'm thinking most obviously of what gets presented in Souls of Black Folk, which proceeds from what Du Bois calls second sight, which to me is a process of cognition, the way in which I see the world, right? And then consciousness of what the way in which you see the world portends, that then leads to what Du Bois understands as a system of being, which is two-ness, which in his way of thinking basically bifurcates to a position of almost the impossibility of resolving the tension between being American and Negro in Du Bois's parlance, all encased in a single Black body. So by putting Malcolm X in conversation with Du Bois, what I was trying to accomplish was basically understand how he's participating in this larger discourse from a position of profound praxis. When I say praxis, I mean in excess of thinking, because we're all involved in praxis. What I think Fred Moten would probably call Black study, right? But praxis in a position of what I call the Black commons, which is not meant to be a hierarchical understanding, but is meant to understand it as a way of common speech that is something that can be engaged by most everyone, but is also of sufficient complexity to be able to take up what we understand to be classically philosophical systems of engagement, right? And that's not to any way pigeonhole the thinking, but to give us a common language in order to understand what he's doing. So when Malcolm begins from a very from a from almost a foundational perspective, when we think of what he's doing with respect to using X in his name, right? To me, that's a refutation of, in many ways, Cartesian systems of thinking, where he's forcing an abandonment of external understanding of who he happens to be in order to replace that with a cipher that means that that cipher needs to be filled in by what we'll use here, Black study, or what he understands as being Black minded, right? So what that means is that then Malcolm is pushing for a perspective and system of cognition that allows him on the fly to be able to see or perceive events, information, anything that comes toward him, and be able to position them to understand how they relate to establishing something like coherent Black identity. When I say coherent Black identity, I'm pushing against where Du Bois ends up in this notion of two-ness, which situates an oppositional way of understanding Blackness internal to Black physical subjectivity that renders two metaphysical conceptualizations of the self that are oppositional to one another. I think the telos of Malcolm's thinking and the telos of even Fanon's understanding of the new humanism basically pushes us to understand something like Black identity that's separate and distinct from a relationship to what we would probably understand as Blackness framed in opposition to whiteness, right? So when Du Bois is working to understand what he wants to situate as Black subjectivity, he starts from a position of understanding that as being referenced from his perception of the way in which white people understand Black people, and then absorbing that in a way that becomes deleterious and has to be eradicated, that arrives at the possibility of bifurcating that system of cognition or consciousness about Blackness from what he would consider to be common self-consciousness. I think what Malcolm X is pushing for and literally runs out of time and space because of his assassination to pull together is something like self-referential Black subjectivity, right? And again, I'm using Black expansively here to include those who find themselves situated as subaltern subjects internal to systems of domination that include patriarchy, anti-Blackness, homophobia, transphobia. You can take your kind of pathological understanding of the other and abstract it to I think Malcolm's system of thinking at this state of transition accommodates that. So that's what I was up to, how I got to the book and what I kind of tried to do with it. So I'll take a couple of minutes and kind of quickly situate the way in which that finds itself as a point of departure for the project that I'm working on now. That's a book in production that's called, I'll try to share something. Professor Reed, I just sent you a note to be able to share. I have a short kind of thing that would kind of help. Here we go.
Yeah, do you have access now?
Yeah, I got it. So the project is called The Door of No Return, with no being stricken in order to situate it as differential from what we understand as the understanding of the door of no return being the impossibility of returning ourselves to the state prior to the middle passage, right? And this project is, as I mentioned earlier, my work is informed in many ways by an engagement with the thinkers that we've covered, but also for this project, Toni Morrison's system of thinking becomes important. So when I talk about this kind of notion of space and time engaging one another, what I'm doing is what I started is to think about Malcolm X's thinking is actually is being futuristic in the sense that he's providing answers to questions that we had not even asked at the time, and we have to then be engaged in a project of thinking that allows us to take systems of thinking and prescriptions that happened 50 years ago and be able to employ them to think about things that are coming in the future in order to have a coherent understanding of our present, right? And so much of that for me was revealed in a quote from Toni Morrison that shows up in her in the essays that were combined in the source of self-regard. And the essay in particular is called Race Matters, and I have a short quote from that that informs the book. Morrison writes, the distrust that race studies receives from the authenticating off-campus community is legitimate only when the scholars themselves have not imagined their own homes, have not unapologetically realized and recognized that the valuable work that they do can be done no other place, have not envisioned academic life as neither straddling opposing worlds nor as a flight from any. W.E.B. Du Bois's observation is a strategy. This is critical for what I'm proposing, not a prophecy or a cure. Beyond the outside-inside double consciousness, this new space postulates the inwardness of the outside. Imagine safety without walls, where we can conceive of a third, if you will pardon the expression, world. Then she puts in quotes, already made for me, both snug and wide open, with the doorway never needing to be closed. And she calls this home. So what this meant for me is to think about the kind of world that we have in front of us. And I'll get through this in a couple of minutes so we can then proceed to kind of discussing it and hope that it's not, that I don't go through it so it becomes incoherent. But what this is meant to propose is that we live in this kind of box here, right? And what we see here is what I call this is anti-Black world, or world kind of one, right? With the door of no return, the middle passage being the kind of one-way trip from what I call Black world prime, which was a world that existed outside of an encounter with becomes the anti-Black world. So obviously, anti-Black world one only becomes relevant as it becomes a point of departure from this kind of linear relationship to the world before the encounter of continental Africa with what we'll call broadly defined, colonialism. That you can pick your date, right? Whether that's 1492 or the 1600s, it doesn't really matter in linear time, but in a metaphysical concept, we understand what we're talking about, right? So internal to that, you have these kind of Du Boisian conceptualizations that are important, right? This kind of Black world and white world that Du Bois references. And what I'm proposing is that what Toni Morrison is talking about is over here is this kind of third world that is at some remove, but accessed through a way of departing this world that implies and references, this is what I'm saying about the space-time continuum, being able to pull things into the future that are useful from the past, is to refuse the notion that this is a door of no return, but to move backward by going forward to what she calls a third world that is unrelated to dialectical relationships, Blackness as dialectically related to whiteness, right? This is a several stage kind of process. So what you see here is when she's talking about Du Bois, and this is the world that Malcolm inhabits in many ways, right? Both of them being Malcolm X and Du Bois, understand there's a Black world and a white world. So in that, for Du Bois is separated by what he calls the color line, right? And internal to Souls of Black Folk, you have this notion of the veil. Well, there are two of them actually. There's a small V veil and there's a big V veil. The big V is this kind of space of internal thinking that represents a space here that is inaccessible to white people. This is where I think Malcolm locates the notion of being Black-minded, where he and Du Bois are in common conversation as to what it means to think self-referentially about Blackness, which is a space of profound generation, right? So that then leads to this kind of era outside of the anti-Black world, which is in many ways where Fanon becomes important here, with his notion of the zone of not-being that shows up in Black Skin, White Mask, where he talks about a decline into a space of generation that allows a stripping a depilatory stripping of negative ways of understanding the body from the body. So if we think about what Malcolm does with the notion of the X, that's what I'm saying here, right? He situates that as a space that has been cathartically uh, cathartically releases internal understandings of self-referential decline, or what Du Bois would understand as double consciousness, and allows an emptying that allows you to fill it with new ways of being. So for me, literature becomes a space there. So then space three, and these are progressive, right? You have to go through these stages in order to be able to get to the door of no return. What I'm arguing is that the Black aesthetic, and what I'm saying here is, and I won't, we don't have the time to kind of go through these references in particular, but I'm arguing that Morrison's 124, Jack the Bear's Hole, and Invisible Man, and The Sign of the Trap, and Melville's Moby Dick are all portals that lead, that these thinkers open up in their imaginary to show a way outside of this world, right? So that leads us to the door of no return, which is the process for getting to this world that Morrison is talking about, which is world three, that I've consciously depicted here as not abutting the way we understand the anti-Black world, but situating itself in some regard in robust, three-dimensional, multi-dimensional fashion, that internal to this is self-referential Blackness. And again, using Blackness in the broad fashion in which Malcolm was using it towards the end of his career or life, and that both end at the same time, where it takes stock of everything that's happened here, but allows new ways of understanding, where the world three includes notions of self-referential being that are not exclusively anything, but are inclusively everything, right? And what this means is that there's the possibility of imagining a world, and this is what I think Fanon means by the new humanism, what Malcolm means by being Black-minded, what Morrison means by this third world, all encompassed, but reach through a kind of process of thinking and experience that allows you to get to this world while still being able to understand and reference this. So it's not a system where a state of being where you'll get to this and all this is forgotten. This remains there, but does not become the system of preoccupation where the only way to understand yourself is in dialectical relationship to whiteness, right? And so that for me is what the kind of new project is devoted to. And these texts that are here are all understandable only from my perspective, only understandable by using Malcolm's system of thinking of being Black-minded as the cognitive map that allows me to take stock of the way these relate themselves to one another, and also the way they point in a direction of what we would probably traditionally consider to be something like Afrofuturism, or a way of being that is referential to non-dialectical Black subjectivity. And just briefly, I said a while ago that Malcolm is a futuristic thinker. His work in the United Nations and his preoccupation with what I call in this book a kind of transnational Black subjectivity is exactly what goes on when South Africa takes the case of Palestinians in Gaza to the International Criminal Court, right? So Malcolm was preoccupied with those who do not have clear access, and he was thinking mostly about Black Americans who do not have a nation, so to speak, were existing in a position of marginalized citizenship, to then be able to use the presence of recognized national identities internal to the United Nations to bring to bear criminal cases against the United States in his case, or in this case, the government of Israel that South Africa basically brings the case for, to support the notion of being able to establish ways in which that aggrieved people can reach some type of justice using international systems of thinking, right? So Malcolm is profoundly international in the system of thinking. So one of the things that I really want to understand is that, and as we move forward, to understand that system of thinking from the 1960s was not parochial at all, right? There's a way of which, and this goes to the way in which I was ignoring Malcolm's thinking in my initial approach to Black thought, was that it seems like it's only meant to be examined internal to the four corners of the United States, when really it's meant to be expansive, and also to show that Black thought, Black American Black American diasporic thinking is international in its character, necessarily so, and not solely related to what's going on in Newark or other places where we saw, particularly in this instance, the Black Panther Party become the kind of system of praxis that is basically taking the thinking of Malcolm X and Frantz Fanon and being able to and seeking to operationalize them in opposition to white supremacy in this country. What I'm proposing is that those were international moves, not domestic moves. And so Malcolm X is therefore this kind of transnational thinker that then presents this notion of the third world both as a metaphysical and physical concept that has to be kind of carefully interrogated to understand both his position and our position as people who I think should be invested in philosophizing into a void of what futurism can look like. So I hope that that was useful and not, did not go too fast through with a series of kind of really serious complications for me. And I'm hoping that we can have some conversation if it's appropriate at this point.
Yeah, excellent. So I only have one, I'm going to synthesize my question into one, and then my students, be ready because the mic is coming to you for questions. Michael, you will hear them, but you won't see them as I move about the room. But my question is, thinking through this paradigm that you're talking about, right? Reflecting backwards to move forward, I'm interested in your thoughts about what we can take from the civil rights movement in our political resistance frameworks now, and then also some things that maybe we might be post in a sense, right? So I'm thinking about Eddie Glaude's book In the Shade of Blue, where he's talking about a post-soul ethic, talking about the 60s, how we've idealized the 60s resistance movement so much that we're just like, we just need to replicate that and just do it all over again, and then we'll be better. We have not taken into account ways in which things have changed over time, how oppressions have evolved and all these other sorts of things. So I want to know whether you want to focus on Malcolm or not. What do you think that we should revisit with Malcolm? And then also, what are some things that we need to use his thought to move forward with?
Yeah, no, that's really useful. So when I mentioned the thinking in motion notion and said that Malcolm was willing to abandon certain things and keep certain things in order to move forward, I think that Hans Blumenberg's notion of the shipwreck is useful here, right? So if we think about 1960s thought as coherent, we can bracket it in whatever ways, right? The long 1960s from basically, Frederick Douglass to, basically systems of thinking that we may find showing up now, right? The long 1960s where you have systems of protest, ways of organizing, et cetera, to address the ways in which white supremacy expresses itself just for the sake of argument, we'll say pre-1965, that were directed at moving the country, lurching it towards something like pretending at least to be a democracy. And I think Eddie does a good job of this. I think Melvin Rogers' work on this is important to interrogate too, right? To understand that America, just to be clear, right? And I say this to students just to put a temporal stamp on this. I was born in 1967, so I was the first person in my family born with the presupposition that I would be able to vote, right? So this is not, these are not things that are written on kind of cave walls. My father grew up in rural Alabama in Hale County, and he was drafted into the Army at 18. There was not a single Black person in the state of Alabama that could vote, right? So we've seen this type of oppression, and we live amongst people who are the product of that, right? So what happens, I think, is those modes that seem to get us to the place that we're in now were useful in that realm, and some of them are still useful now. So I think, and this is addressed particularly to academic communities, right? You saw this, people have been talking about this letter from the Department of Education that basically says you're not allowed to have, whatever, just for say the Black Student Union, or you can't have that, right? It doesn't mean that you can't have it. It means that they've decided that they're going to try to force universities and colleges to not fund it, but that doesn't mean that you can't still do it, right? So what's useful from the 1960s forward is this notion that you don't have to have institutional uh, uh, support for radicalism, right? Like, the Black Panther Party was not formed by, any department of the United States government, right? Black student unions at the beginning were students who gathered together in community to think about things. So part of that is useful now, but then what that means is that, and this is exemplified by what I said at the beginning of this in referencing the project that you're engaged in, we have technology now that allows us to engage with one another that I don't think has been uh, carefully understood with respect to its utility in movements, right? So as a practical matter, in the 1960s, if I wanted to communicate with you all at Butler University, I either had to come there or I had to write you a letter, right? And that letter could take, however long it took to get there. Then we could have some kind of coherent conversation. We could write back and forth. So the rapidity with which we can engage these kinds of problems, I think, has outstripped some notions of organizing that were useful in the 1960s, meaning that we can populate thinking in ways where the sit-in, the march, et cetera, are useful as demonstrations, but may have been technically exhausted in their potentiality for what we need to accomplish now with respect to how quickly we can move information. So I think part of the project here is to take Malcolm's notion of being Black-minded and apply that to technological innovation to then give us the tools that we need to understand the lessons we learned from the 1960s that I think were lost. And then I'll turn back to you and hope that this is useful. I think that my generation in college I was in undergraduate school from 85 to 89, basically, and so what mattered to us was the South Africa protests, et cetera, right? I think that we turned ourselves outwards and neglected some of the inward consideration where a lot of and I'll just be cut to the point, right? There was stuff that we should not have tolerated that we did because we thought that a lot of these problems had been resolved, right? With the voters' rights movement, post Brown versus Board of Education. So we're suffering the wages of not finishing that deal during the late 20th century that positioned this kind of regressive return, right? So when I talk about this notion of the third world, what that means, this world that Morrison's talking about, that remove that needed to happen is a space in which we still lingered in the aftermath of the 1960s and 1970s without pushing the movement forward, thinking that we had achieved certain gains that were all too easy to kind of, as we're seeing now, all too easy to be dismantled. So I think that part of what we learned from the 1960s is a continued engagement with that system of thinking to understand the limitations of how that applies to our current moment, but also to be inspired by the results and the example of those people who presented themselves as profound personal and institutional sacrifice to get us to the position that we're in now.
That's really good. My students, it's your go. Any of you all have questions? Okay. Remember to introduce yourself.
Hello, Dr. Sawyer. My name is Jimmy. I'm a student in Dr. Reed's class. When it comes to your figure about reaching to your third world, what would you say is the most difficult aspect in order for us to get there that you see in the coming future?
Yeah, I think part of the most difficult aspect of it is the leap forward, right? There's a void. So what has to happen, and this is where the imagination of the Black aesthetic and artist basically is filled in these blanks that we have not operationalized, right? So if you think about what it means to theorize beyond our current moment, right? So what I'm arguing, and I think what these other thinkers are arguing, and I'm putting Morrison in conversation with Ellison, in conversation with Melville, and then we can expand that concentrically out as much as you want, right? To include all kinds of other ways of thinking. What that means is that you have to be willing to leave home to get home, right? So the notion of refusal to return, because what happens is and this is back to what I was saying about the comfort that we thought we had experienced, right? We thought we had prepared the type of home and safe space that we needed with the gains that happened from kind of the 1960s kind of forward. And you get to the election of President Obama, right? And so it's very easy, it's all too easy to think that you've solved this problem. So the hard part is to be able to accept those gains and understand their utility, but also be able to understand that those are not, that you can't linger in them, right? So it's this kind of very difficult leap of faith that's required that is most easily analogized to, the leap of faith of somebody getting in some very small boat and sailing west out of Europe and not knowing where they're going, right? And hoping to find something on the other side, right? Now you can do that. And what you ought to do when you get there is be able to positively engage the new thing that you find rather than trying to destroy it, right? Which is, again, a kind of black-minded system of thinking that's egalitarian, expansive, inclusive, et cetera, but it's exploratory, right? So it requires us to abandon certain things. So what I'm saying is that something as simple as, you get bad news that, the Department of Education says you can't do X, Y, and Z, so institutions can't do X, Y, and Z anymore to support you. You understand that, you accept it, you give yourself kind of 15 seconds to be mad about it, but then you abandon that and move forward to the next thing, which is what Malcolm X was up to doing, right? Never forgetting what it was that got you to that point, but being able to move to the next thing, that's profoundly difficult to do because what systems of power will do is try to situate safe places to land regressively to return you to the place that you came from. So you situate these kinds of pockets that seem safe, then you return to them and realize that you're just stuck there, right? So this is the burning building reference that integrating into a burning building that Professor Reed raised that comes out of Martin Luther King's system of thinking, right? He's worried that you're going to a place that then gets rendered to appear like it accommodates a type of self-referential Black being, but is really a trap, right? So you have to be able to abandon those places and move forward to the next thing without a whole lot of information about what that next thing happens to be, and then finding out about it as we kind of push our way through.
Hi, President Sawyer, Dr. Sawyer, I was just, I'm Isabella, I'm from Dr. Reed's class. I've heard you mention a couple times this term about Black self-referentialism, and I would just really love to hear kind of more about that and like what that means to you, I guess.
Yeah, so this comes directly from what I take as Morrison's direct point of reference to what Du Bois is situating. So Du Bois is profoundly influenced by his engagement with kind of Hegel, right? This comes directly from his study in kind of Germany, right? So you're involved in dialectical thinking where you have, obviously, a thesis, antithesis, then synthesis of those things, right? So what I'm arguing is that self-referential Blackness needs to engage itself and others rather than opposing itself to kind of whiteness, right? Which is all too easy to do. So if we think about the ways, this is just in common kind of parlance, right? We think about anti-Blackness, we understand the recovery of Blackness as being the necessity of dismantling something like anti-Blackness, right? Self-referential Blackness doesn't worry about at that stage of the game what other people think about you. It resolves itself kind of internally, then presents itself in ways to kind of address what's external to it, right? So what Malcolm is doing, and this in many ways is kind of classic Nation of Islam thinking that preoccupied itself with that kind of internal thinking, but then use it to cordon itself off from the rest of the world. So what I'm doing is kind of an expansion improvisation on that to imagine that there's a way to kind of have that internal dialogue, internal dialectic, like who am I, right? Like look at yourself, right? This is directly from in my reading of what's going on with Ellison and Invisible Man, right? It's like this notion of invisibility is also respect to how you look at yourself, right? So you have to look at yourself, be able to see yourself in ways that are not encumbered by what Du Bois would consider second sight, meaning that you understand yourself through the eyes of the other what Malcolm is saying is that Black-minded means you understand yourself through the eyes of your understanding of who you are, that then in my mind positions you to be able to present yourself to the point of discourse in ways that deliver a different result than the result that we perceive now, that were about what Dr. King and the rest were calling notions of integration as opposition with separation, right? There's another term that we'd have to unearth. There's other language that we need to understand what that actually means. That is not segregationist in any of its systems of thinking. So just briefly, right, this is how the right has weaponized the notions of the way we understand Black ways of being, right? So you'll see that in the letter that I'm referencing, they talk about, first off, there are no campus organizations that do not allow people, that refuse other people to join. So there's no reason why a person who doesn't happen to be Black can't join the Black Student Union. So that's a fallacy, right? But what they're saying in their productive understanding of it is that you've situated a way of being that's only oppositional to their way of thinking of whiteness as the way in which we understand the world. What Malcolm X and these thinkers are proposing, and the way I understand it, is you can self-referentially, we're proposing we self-referentially understand ourselves, that then is expansive in ways that include the possibility of engaging others without having to oppose others to define yourself. Does that help a little bit?
No, that's really good. That's really good. We can open it up both to, and Ernest got something, cool. And then if anybody else has bubbling questions, we'll open it up.
Hi, I'm Erin. I'm another one of Dr. Reed's students. So early on in your speech, you talked about your experience, learning and just being around knowledge of Malcolm X just because of your location near Chicago. And you also briefly talked about how often days in education, especially in my experience, like in high school, when talking about the civil rights movement, people really focus on MLK and sort of gloss over these other African philosophers such as Malcolm X. Why do you think this is still a problem in today's day and age? And also, do you have any suggestions for people who maybe want to further educate themselves on less known Black philosophers that perhaps aren't taking a class like Dr. Reed, where you're being exposed to those types of speakers?
Yeah. So why it happens is because it doesn't. So this is preoccupation. This kind of misreading in some ways of this is how Dr. King gets co-opted by this is why you'll hear someone like who knows, right? You can pick your villain from anti-Blackness that marshal Dr. King in order to talk about colorblind societies, right? There is no quote from Malcolm X that you can use to kind of pull that stunt, right? It just doesn't work. And so what happens is then he gets reduced in certain ways to be a kind of thinker of violence, right? This is where the by any means necessary thing gets misused. So what happens is it becomes a third rail of thinking that leads, in many ways, Malcolm X then leads directly to Fanon and the wretched of the earth, and this notion of violence as a cathartic system for resolving social ills. So basically, the academy, and when I say the academy, I mean systems of education broadly defined, and culture, predominantly white culture, wants to render those things either obscure, opaque, or inert, right? So what happens with Malcolm X is that when the stamp came out, that was like Malcolm X could never have imagined himself being on a stamp that the United States government puts out, right? He would think that's completely ridiculous in certain kinds of ways, but you can see it's a move from people who basically were invested in a type of integrative thinking to basically say Malcolm X is not as bad as you think he is, and we can use him to send our mail around, right? Okay, yeah, he's not as bad as you think he is, but he is in another kind of way because he rejects these kinds of notions of we'll just use the term whitewashing or watering down a system of thinking in order to not have it exist in its fullness, where we can take what we need from it, understand some things are useful, not completely thought through, or no longer applicable in the current situation, right? So all that happens, right? So that's what happens in kind of primary, secondary education. And the goal now is to also prevent college from being able to examine them. So it's not even it's the problem that you've unearthed is more complicated than us not being fortunate enough to be able to enroll in Professor Reed's course, right? It also means that the attempt now is to make that a universal condition where we're not allowed, and this goes for feminist and gender studies, this goes for you name it, right? Any type of system of thinking that seems to undermine the conceptualization of the dominant ways of thinking as being the only way of thinking. So, what we can do is things like this, right? This should not be the only time, and it should not have to always be formal, right? There should be continual conversation that takes advantage of technology in and outside of whatever systems you want to use that allows us to kind of keep pushing this. And this is where I wanted to engage the way in which Malcolm is a thinker of the Black commons, right? That then it has to be outward facing. So we engage communities in wherever they are in order to keep the conversation moving constantly. Because, and honestly, and I've said this in other frameworks, right? There's not much that I learned in graduate school or any place else that I didn't hear growing up on the South Side in Black barbershops, frankly, where people had very coherent conversations in the 1970s. And I would just sit there and listen when I was with my older cousins or my uncles who would take me there. And you would learn certain things. And the language was not what we would consider the academic language, but the system of thinking was the same. So much of it is a system of translation where we have to be able to go back and forth between those two systems of dialogue that allow us to speak coherently to pretty much everyone. And that includes being able to speak internationally as well. And, it's just a matter of creating curriculum, creating reading lists, having talks and engaging people, I think.
Hey, Dr. Sawyer, my name's Ali. My question is, so basically I recently, like in the past year or two, I read the autobiography of Malcolm X and it was an amazing, life-changing book, but I know that it's such a small piece of the picture, sort of. And so it's kind of a two-part question. One, what do you think the autobiography gets wrong about Malcolm's thinking? And what do you think is kind of the best next step of better understanding his life and his thinking past reading the autobiography?
Yeah, so I take this, I don't know if it's a different approach, but this is just my approach to critique, right? So I don't want to frame it as things that Alex Haley or whomever is working on Malcolm anything gets wrong. I want to frame it as apertures by which we can use that we can employ as points of departure, right? So, and any person who tells their personal story, they're going to frame it in particular ways, right? And understanding the project that Alex Haley was invested in producing this book and what Malcolm was using it for in order to present his message, that means that there are going to be what we would consider aporia or slippage from facts, right? That's fine, right? And so a lot of that work has been done to kind of shore that up, right? It's been the kind of critique of Alex Haley's work, the critique of like the early versions that were watered down by the publisher, et cetera. And all that to me is fairly predictable, and in no way would ever put me in a position to tell people that one of the most important books that I've ever read is the autobiography of Malcolm X, period, for whatever faults you determine to have in it. So yeah, there's all kinds of stuff in it that may or may not be useful, but I want to frame it as opportunities versus failures, if that makes any sense. So what that means is then there's a lot of work that's been done since then. I'm thinking of Manning Marable's work. I'm thinking about The Dead Are Arising that came out. Tamara Payne finishing her father's work on, from a journalistic perspective, understanding what Malcolm X was up to. So what that means is that in any of these realms, and this is back to what I was mentioning, gesturing at this notion of collective engagement, we have to be able to participate across what we would consider to be disciplines, right? So there's journalistic accounts of Malcolm that are useful, there are historical accounts, there are biographical accounts, there are theoretical and philosophical accounts, there are literary accounts, there are aesthetic accounts. We have to be able to synthesize all of those and use them each for their benefits. And that gives us the opportunity to holistically assemble an understanding of a figure who I think is as important as anybody from the 20th century, and then through that study, be able to use that as points of departure, while all the time being aware of where there's slippage, but not being preoccupied with it, if that makes any sense, right? I think it's easy to, you can take anybody's work and figure out what's wrong with it. I think what I try to express and what has been useful for me is to use those things as positives rather than negatives, if that makes sense. This doesn't mean that like I'll read something that's clearly, racist or stupid or whatever the case, harmful and illegitimate or meant to do some type of harm and not call it for what it is. But I'll do that. But when we're talking about canonical texts like the autobiography of Malcolm X, I think that those points of slippage are actually points of advantage that we can use to move our thinking forward.
Hi, Dr. Sawyer. I'm Julie Searcy. I brought my global and historical studies class. We're looking at Africa, colonialism and post-colonialism. And we're here today with Dr. Reed's class. And I was hoping, and I'm so thrilled because I think this was so rich and thought-provoking, but I was hoping when I'm like, oh, we should go to this, that we could think through your talk about the ways, the connections between people like Malcolm X and other civil rights activists and Fanon and other kinds of thinkers who were at the same time both working for freedom in different spaces. So I really love that you talked about Fanon, and we're about to read him in the class. And I would love to hear a little bit more about the way you are thinking about the, I guess, conversation maybe Fanon, Malcolm X, Toni Morrison are having about Black identity, Black freedom.
Yeah, no, that's really positive. I think you're right to be able to do that. I'm working on a piece now that basically, fictional piece obviously, but basically has letters between Malcolm X and Frantz Fanon from 1959 to 1961. It basically does just that, right? To kind of have them in kind of engagement with one another. That would have been a critical conversation that would have been useful for us, right? There's all kinds of these things that didn't happen. But I think that, I think a couple of things, right? I think, so in literature, we call this intertextuality, right? This notion that, someone will reference some other text, and then if you dig deeply enough, because, I work on Moby Dick, and Moby Dick is, you could write an entire book that's longer than Moby Dick with the literary references in Moby Dick, right? Because Melville had such possession of the canon. But at the same time, I think that there's a metaphysical relationship to thinking that I don't want to present as mystic or something like that. But I think it's something as easy as the fact that people who are examining a similar phenomenon can come to similar conclusions without them talking to them, right? So when Melville is thinking about Blackness and whiteness as being a problem in Moby Dick, presenting the white whale as being actually representative of evil in opposition to ways that we understand white typically as being just the opposite of that, right? What he's doing is opening a portal that then speaks directly to what Ralph Ellison is doing in Invisible Man, where, he in the introduction, he's preoccupied with the church service that basically is the same church service that happens in the sign of that happens early in Moby Dick when Ishmael walks in and sees a Black church service happening. That's literally the church service that Ralph Ellison uses in Invisible Man to then progress the story forward, right? And I'm arguing that the text of that church service is actually the text of when Ishmael walks out. And I don't want to get into the weeds on this because it's fascinating to me, but other people care less about what's going on in Moby Dick for really good reasons, probably. But the text is about the killing of children, right? My argument, that's what Toni Morrison is doing in Beloved. So you can say, yeah, this is just by coincidence, but my point is that they're all examining this kind of notion of how we interact with something like the world that is profoundly separated into Black and white spaces, and negatively and deleteriously so. And these 3 or 4 things keep coming up, right? So then my point is to take those three or four things to put them in conversation with one another, prospectively, introspectively, and prescriptively, and then try to move the conversation forward and then use that to hope that other people who are thinking about similar things can engage at the same time, right? So that's why Fanon, who doesn't really have a coherent understanding, and I don't mean coherent as hierarchical, he doesn't have a coherent understanding of America with respect to Black people, right? So, people who work on Fanon biographically have understood that Richard Wright's wife was setting up Ceylon in France for him to be able to engage with people to understand Black America, to be able to theorize carefully, right? These are the type of conversations that I'm proposing that we can facilitate now without having to show up in Paris, right? And Corey's project here exemplifies, kind of, this series that he's putting together is exactly that opportunity for us to all engage each other in ways that would have been very difficult in the past, that I'm thinking are the possibility of, you bring your classes engaged in what seems like a different type of thinking, but to see that there's resonance constantly about these things and be able to put those in coherent conversation, to me, is what I would call something like, education probably, and learning.
Awesome. We have time for maybe one more, last 5 minutes. Everybody? I didn't see any online. If anyone online wants to give a question either, that's possible.
Hi there. Dr. Sawyer, this is Stuart Glenn. I'm a colleague of Corey's. Thank you so much for this talk. It's really fascinating. And one of the things that I've been sort of struggling to follow is, as an analytic philosopher who does not speak this language in quite the same way, but it feels to me like there's two things going on here. And I think this represents the movements that you're talking about. There's political struggle, and there's a struggle about consciousness. And I feel you talking about the way in which you can undertake both at the same time, and that we can, and that we can't let political circumstances prevent us from moving forward in the struggle about consciousness. I think that's what I got, but if you could expand a little and explain a little bit how those two journeys are related.
So, yeah. So they're related in nonlinear fashion, right? So I don't want to, and this is part of what I was trying to get across, this may be helpful. So I don't want it to appear that so I start with cognition, consciousness to being. That's the kind of progression, right? What I'm saying is that cognition, consciousness, and a certain type of being precede cognition and consciousness precede being, but being also precedes this process that I'm talking about. So what I mean is that proceeding on different tracks, you're filling in the blanks of particular types of consciousness that lead to particular types of self-referential being as you're going along. And some of these things proceed on different timelines, right? So it's not possible, it's really not even possible to write them because they're happening in kind of palimpsestic relationship to one another. So to this point, right? So say for instance that, and they're also happening against a paradigm of cultural understanding. So Bildung in the language that you would be using, right? Where you understand the relationship of an individual to a certain type of cultural milieu based upon that cultural milieu. So the thing that preoccupies me, and I hope this is helpful, and we could probably have a much longer conversation, hopefully, about this, right? Is that as subjects find themselves reacting internal to a particular type of system, that system is also necessarily altered by that reaction, right? So then what the problematic becomes being able to understand subjects in transition between these two, because I think analytic philosophy and also continental philosophy have really acute instruments in order to understand static subjectivity. What I'm trying to do is to figure out how to understand subjects in motion towards other types of potentially unstable subjectivity, right? So it's a constantly moving target, and so it's difficult to pin down in a talk or even in writing how that is actually operating. And so my second proposal is that much of that can be expressed sonically, because in sound we can hear a bunch of things resolve themselves at the same time coherently, right? So as a practical matter, if I'm talking and you're talking, everyone else in here is talking about the same thing that I'm talking about, we're not going to be able to understand each other, even though we're talking about the same thing. If you walk across your campus to wherever your music department happens to be, there's an orchestra performing a piece of music. Each one of those instruments is doing what it's doing, but when this is done properly, we can hear the coherent whole and be able to glean some type of information from that, right? So what I'm saying is that there's a way that we can adjust our cognitive lens in order to be able to hear, to extract out of what seems to be cacophony or abstraction, something like a coherent understanding of that process in order to arrive at something like being. And from my perspective, I'm thinking that's finds itself in literature and sound in ways that have been expressed most coherently in the Black aesthetic.
That's right on time. Can we get a speaker? Like, no, we can have the place for this.
No, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And then,
Well, I really appreciate you speaking today. We have one more next Thursday with Dr. K. Bailey Thomas, and that's going to be amazing. Students who want BCR credit can come see me up here. Otherwise, thank you, Michael. I'll see you soon.
all right, thanks, Corey.
Yeah.
Ciao.